McDermott. And in this video, we're going to take a look at two campaigns that really kick off the final phase of the American Civil War. That is, the start of those major battles driven by General Grant and forcing the Confederates to defend closer and closer to Richmond. Following the Battle of Chattanooga, General Grant was summoned to Washington and promoted by President Lincoln to the rank of Lieutenant General. He was the third American officer following George Washington and Winfield Scott to attain that rank. General Grant was also given command of all of the United States armies, totaling more than 500,000 men. Recognizing the war would be decided in the East, that is, in Virginia, he established his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac while keeping General Meade in command of the Army. His instructions to General Meade were very specific. Wherever Lee goes, there you will go also. It had to be an uncomfortable situation for General Meade to have his boss traveling with his own headquarters staff, right coincidental with the Army. But at any rate, it seems that they talked to each other frequently, and happily for General Meade, it appears that he was in complete accord with General Grant's direction. The Battle of the Wilderness, fought between the 5th and the 7th of May, 1864, was the first in a series of actions that began to reveal General Grant's intent. The Army of the Potomac crossed the repeated river at 3 separate locations and moved into the Wilderness, a 70 square mile area of rough ground covered by stunted and dense secondary growth timber and brush that was interlaced with vines and thorns. Virtually unsettled and traversed by only a few confusing and unimproved roads, the Wilderness had been the downfall of previous Union commanders, and General Grant planned to move south quickly before the Confederates could catch him with this strung-out Union Army. He intended to bring the Confederates to battle on better ground where his superior numbers and federal firepower could be brought to bear. Not knowing where the Federals intended to advance, the rebels were encamped over a large arc to the west of the Wilderness. When the Union plan became clear, General Lee moved quickly to intercept and attack the right flank of those columns that were advancing down those primitive wilderness roads. Badly outnumbered with approximately 65,000 men to the 120,000 Federals, General Lee knew the odds of turning back the Union troops were far better if the fight was at close quarters in that confusing environment. Early on the 5th of May, the Union Army was moving south when it was forced to confront Confederates unexpectedly advancing on them from the west, or that is on the right flank. General Lee had moved faster than either Generals Grant or Meade had expected, and a second rebel attack soon developed farther to the south against lead elements of the Union Army, and the Federals were forced to halt and defend themselves. A strong counterattack stopped the Confederates and then pushed them back in confusion, although the situation eventually stabilized. Fierce fighting continued after dark without either side gaining a significant advantage. The combat was at close quarters, and dense smoke from a growing brush fire in the Wilderness added to the overall confusion, which best described the battlefield. During the night, both sides attempted to form lines and construct breastworks, following a day of surprises, spirited attacks, and bloody counterattacks. At 5 o'clock the following morning, Federal attacks were stopped with heavy losses except in the south, where the Confederate defenders were initially overwhelmed. So Generals Grant and Meade had the army up early and organized to attack at the first glimmer of first light. The Federal attack was soon stopped with the arrival of Confederate reinforcements. Later in the day, the Federal left flank was surprised and pushed back by a Confederate attack using an unfinished railroad cut, but that night the lines were again stabilized. On the 7th of May, both armies faced each other from behind fortified positions, peering across a half-mile of shredded and burning wilderness. General Grant decided continuing the battle would be inconclusive and prepared to maneuver to the southeast. That is, he pulled his army back and, facing to the south, began to move, forcing General Lee to protect Richmond by intercepting him, by also moving south and intercepting him at Spotsylvania Courthouse. The Wilderness was a blind and blundering battle, and losses were never clarified because of the nature of the terrain. Union casualties were between 15 and 18,000 men, and the Confederate losses were estimated from 7,700 to 11,000 men. Confederate artillery officer Robert Stiles recorded how an observant friend of his analyzed the feelings of the rebel troops before the battle. That friend had just made his way back from a furlough, and he passed the night with an infantry regiment from his own county that contained many of his former schoolmates and friends and neighbors. He did not detect any depression or apprehension of disaster or weakness of purpose, but he says he did miss the buoyant spirit, the quips, the jests, the jokes, such as had previously characterized the different rebel commands. He says that there seemed to be sifting through the ranks the conviction that the struggle ahead was of a different character from any that they had previously experienced in the past, a sort of premonition. And that was a feeling that if one army outnumbers another, and the larger can be reinforced, and the smaller not at all, then if the stronger side will make up its mind to stand all the killing the weaker can accomplish, there can be only one result, one eventual outcome. In other words, even the troops understood that the Federal reserve of manpower would eventually overwhelm the South. A Union soldier named Warren Goss recalled his experience when he found himself near Chancellorsville on the ground that had been fought over in 1863. And he wrote, "Weather-stained remnants of clothing, rusty gun barrels and bayonets, tarnished brass and equipment, with bleaching bones and grinning skulls, marked this memorable field. In the cavity of one of those skulls was a nest of 3 speckled eggs of a field bird, and yet in another was a wasp nest, life in embryo, appearing in the skull." Assigned to an artillery battery, he described the scene once the battle had started. And again, writing, "No one could see the fight 50 feet from him. The roll and crackle of musketry was something terrible, even to the veterans of many battles. The lines were very near each other, and from the dense underbrush and the tops of trees came puffs of smoke, the ping of the bullet, and the yell of the enemy." The Reverend A.M. Stewart, a chaplain with the Union Army, recorded his impressions when he wrote, "That awful, what sickening scenes. Here a dear friend struck dead by a bullet through the head or through his heart. Another fallen with legs or thigh broken and looking up to you for help. Another dropping his gun and walking slowly to the rear to lie down in the brush and die." Darkness found the two armies much in the same position as in the opening of that battle. Union soldier Frank Wilkinson later wrote, "I could have caught a pot full of bullets if I had a strong iron pot tied up on a pole like a butterfly net." And this ends the Battle of the Wilderness, opening the door to the next battle, bringing the Army of the Potomac south into Virginia. During the night of 7 May 1864, the Army of the Potomac pulled out of its lines there in the Wilderness and began shifting southeast, forcing General Lee to respond. General Grant was seizing the initiative and setting the pace of the campaign. He had 100,000 men, and he proposed to get between the Confederate Army of approximately 56,000 men and Richmond by occupying the crossroads at a place called Spotsylvania Courthouse. Informed of the movement, General Lee immediately ordered his troops to intercept the Federal advance and had soldiers entrenched at Spotsylvania on the 8th of May in time to repel the first Federal assault. On that same day, General Grant ordered the bulk of his cavalry to cut loose from the Army of the Potomac, pass around the left of Lee's army, and attack his cavalry. Once that was accomplished, Union cavalry were supposed to destroy supply depots and railroad communications behind the Confederates and possibly threaten Richmond before returning to the army. The citizens of Richmond, as well as the 4,000 home guard and convalescent defenders of the city, were put in a high state of alarm. Rebel supplies and communications were destroyed, and Confederate General Jeb Stuart was killed in a cavalry fight at Yellow Tavern. The Federal cavalry then passed through Richmond's outer defenses, but found that the inner defenses were too strong, and they were forced to turn east, attempting to cross the Chickahominy River. Finding the bridges destroyed, they paused to bridge the river under fire and eventually returned to General Grant's control. But the raid did not seriously cripple Confederate cavalry, and while the raid was in progress, General Grant was left to move blindly in hostile territory, not unlike the case that General Lee experienced in the run-up to the battle at Gettysburg, when Confederate cavalry went off on a long-winded ride, leaving him largely blind to the Federal movement. When the two armies arrived at Spotsylvania, they dug in, although it was difficult for Federal commanders to identify the exact location and strength of Confederate lines because of the dense timber and the thick brush. A rebel skirmish line was pushed well forward to keep Union scouts from making an accurate reconnaissance. General Grant ordered a corps of 3 divisions to get behind and attack the rebels' left flank, and although initially promising, the movement was stopped and the troops were recalled. On the afternoon of 10 May, the Federals assaulted the Confederate defenses on a broad front. Very few Union troops got into the rebels' positions before they were killed or captured, and the survivors of that attack streamed back into their own trenches. Later that evening, a concentrated assault by 12 regiments of Federal infantry attacked on a narrow front and overran the first and second lines of Confederate entrenchments on the forward edge of a salient that became known as the Mule Chute. The attackers were left isolated, however, when reinforcements failed to advance, and they were subsequently forced to withdraw. General Grant ordered a repeat of that assault on the Mule Chute for early on the 12th of May, but on a massive scale in this case. Initially overwhelming the defenders, the Federals were finally stopped by a counterattack. Both sides fed additional troops into the battle, and fighting was hand-to-hand and savage throughout the day and into that night before exhaustion brought an end to the struggle. The next night, the Federals conducted a movement to the left to threaten the Confederates' flank, but fog and bad weather slowed the cross-country march, and General Lee was able to shift forces and extend his lines and confront that flanking attack. Thinking the Confederate left must now be weakened, a final Federal assault on the 18th of May was also stopped. The rebels countered the next day with an equally unsuccessful attempt to turn a federal flank. General Grant then abandoned the battlefield and began another swing to the left, forcing General Lee out of his fortifications. Federal casualties at Spotsylvania totaled over 18,000 men, and while the Confederates lost between 10 and 13,000 soldiers, most of the senior officers of both armies had still not learned the futility of assaulting strongly held field fortifications with infantry. Although the artillery of the period was devastating against troops that were caught in the open, it was relatively ineffective against even crude breastworks, and fuses were too erratic to enable gunners to place accurate fire on men located behind fortifications. It eventually became clear, however, that men who were well entrenched and armed with an accurate rifle were a serious threat to advancing infantry. As the fighting at the Mule Shoe unfolded, General Grant sent a situation report and a statement of intent to the War Department. And in his message, he said, "We have now ended the 6th day of very heavy fighting. Our losses have also been heavy, as well as those of the enemy. We have taken over 5,000 prisoners, while he has taken from us but a few, except our stragglers. I am now sending back all my wagons for a fresh supply of provisions and ammunition, and I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." Unlike previous commanders of the Army of the Potomac, Grant had no intention of pulling back, let alone pulling back as far as the Potomac River. A man named Horace Porter, an officer on General Grant's staff, described his impressions of the battle at the Mule Shoe. "It was chiefly a savage hand-to-hand fight across the barricades. Rank after rank was riddled by shot and shell and bayonet thrusts, and finally sank a mass of torn and mutilated corpses. Then fresh troops rushed madly forward to replace the dead, and so the murderous work went on. Guns were run up close to the parapet, and double charges of canister played their part in the bloody work. The fence rails and logs in the barricades were shattered into splinters, and trees over 1.5 feet in diameter were cut completely in two. The opposing flags were in places thrust against each other, and muskets were fired with muzzle against muzzle. Skulls were crushed with clubbed muskets, and men stabbed with swords and bayonets that were thrust between the logs in the parapet, which was the only separation between the combatants. Even the darkness of night failed to stop this fierce contest. So the Confederate troops who had built those barricades stayed right up against them, and the attacking Federals came right up against them on the far side, trying to get over, and it was a bloody business. Partially in response to criticism about the heavy casualties, General Grant made the following statement to a newspaper reporter, and Grant said, "I do not know of any way to put down this rebellion and restore the authority of the government except by fighting, and fighting means that men will get killed. If the people of the country expect that the war can be conducted to a successful issue in any other way than fighting, they must get somebody other than myself to command this army." Despite those heavy casualties, President Lincoln was not about to replace General Grant, and the Federal Army maneuvered again to eventually attack Confederate defenses at a crossroads village named Cold Harbor. And that's when we will again pick up this story with the next video. And until then, God bless America.